tonight we're going to cover the entire timeline of the Bible, but then because it's just so much content to go through and we're only going to have like an hour, we're going to subsequently break it down into 5 different sections that will happen in the next 2 weeks, and 2 weeks after that again, and then 2 weeks after that again. And so we've actually put it on the timeline as well, those sections, and so you can see like what chunk of history we'll be covering for each of those dates. And so those are the dates for the next 5 lessons, and then we'll conclude. So tonight's the first one, and then we've got 5 different parts, and then we conclude the 7th one will be an overview again, which will be, I think will be really fun just to see like clearly we understand how it fits into place. And then also the goal kind of is to understand the book of Hebrews, which if you've read the book of Hebrews in the New Testament, there are a lot of references to the Old Testament. There are a lot of things in there that without a lot of Old Testament context, it can be kind of confusing because it's talking about 2 different covenants, and it even uses the same word covenant for 2 different things. And so if you guys can read the book of Hebrews from what we've done here and understand it better, then I think we've done something really good. So that's kind of the goal. The whole thing is to have just a survey knowledge of the Bible. And also, our goal is to be objective in this. And so, obviously, there's going to be theology. There's going to be theology that's implicit in what we talk about. But what we're going to do the best is to keep it strictly to what the text says. So, for example, the Bible says God created the heavens and the earth. We're not going to talk about evolution. We're not going to talk about if it's 10,000 years old or 65 million or billion years old or whatever. It just says God created the heavens and the earth. So the interpretation will be up to you guys. The idea is just to give you what happens and enough historical information that maybe isn't included in the Bible, but it's backed up by other resources we have, so that you can at least approach these texts that are difficult. Some of them are difficult with it's kind of like a map. You'll approach it and you'll know where you are. You'll know where this falls into the history of Israel. You'll know why this is a disputed passage, because it doesn't make sense if it's 10,000 years old. If a geologist says it's 65 million years old. So then you can start looking at these things and you don't get as confused. So those are the goals. And Madison she's done a lot of research in the past few days on how the Bible is formed. And I thought it would be good to start with that as well. Like, what exactly is the Bible?
So quickly, I think most of you are familiar with the Bible. And 66 books of the Bible, 39 Old Testament, 27 New Testament, written by 40 different authors over a 1,500-year span. And there's multiple different kinds of genres: poetry, narrative, there are letters, So you guys are probably, this crowd, pretty familiar with all that. And with the Old Testament, it came together strongly by oral tradition. They had a very strong sense of oral tradition that they kept up with. And the Dead Sea Scrolls, which were discovered in the 1900s, like the 1960s, found copies of the Old Testament that were preserved from 150 BC. And the ones they found were the exact copies we have today, 2,000 years later. So they tried to keep that buried together. In the New Testament, there are a couple of factors, like how did it even come together? Why do we have these books? A couple of factors. A guy named Marcion in like 90 AD, to about 150 AD is when he lived, and he didn't like the God of the Old Testament, which I personally wrestled with at one point. And he started to edit and pick and choose, and even in books of the New Testament, he liked Paul pretty well, but he was very anti-Semitic, so he didn't like the things pro-Jewish that he said, so he cut those out. He didn't really like Luke, definitely didn't like Matthew, because he was all about Judaism. And so he started to edit and kind of like cut and paste his own version of the Bible, and the churches at the time were like, whoa, 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 and they're freaking out. And so that kind of cultivated and started thinking, okay, maybe we really should have something concrete. And also, Christians were being persecuted at the time, and what's worth dying over were some of the questions they had to deal with. The sun was going to burn, copy of the Gospel of Thomas. Well, they didn't really see that as worth dying over, but some of Paul's letters, they did. And so those things started to form together, and then Constantine became the emperor of Rome in 313, and so they were allowed to have more formal conversations, and they had all these councils, and there were some criteria they used to determine which book should be in the Bible. Was it accepted by the church at large? Was it widely used? Was it written by an eyewitness of Jesus or a close associate of an eyewitness? Was it written 100 years during the first 100 years or not? It couldn't, if it was someone like, hey, I found this, it's inspired, it's 300 AD, but it says Paul's signature, it's like, well, it had to, okay, maybe it was written in the first century, but was it widely accepted? So they had a certain criteria they used. It had to be consistent with the rest of doctrine. They saw it as inspired, which is pretty subjective, but they were able to agree upon it. There are some that they read that clearly were not consistent with the rest, and they didn't feel were inspired by God. And so that is largely what led to it, and the church has stuck with that since the 300s. And so the way we have structured this, and we believe the Bible is structured into covenants, how God has chosen, as we see in the Bible, to relate to his people is through covenants. And so David is going to outline those, because once you understand the framework for that, then you can just fill in the rest of this. And so we'll see that. So you want to go for that?
I would say, like, it's not even our choice, like, we just chose to arrange like covenant. If you want to understand the Bible, you have to understand covenants. You have to understand what a covenant is. So, does anyone want to take a guess or have a good answer or already know what is a covenant? Okay, a covenant, yes, it's a contract. And it's a contract specifically used, it's kind of more of a religious term now. If you were to look up in the dictionary, it would have a religious association to it. It is a contract between mankind and a deity. And in the Bible, it's between God and man. And so, if you want to understand the Bible, you have to understand that God has always related to man in a covenant, in an agreement he's made with man. He's always related to that, and he's always been faithful to that. He's always kept his word. And so, really, there are 4 major covenants in the Bible that kind of dictate the rest of the content of the scriptures, that dictate how he's going to behave, and how God, and consistently, how he does, how he holds the Israelites to the word and to the agreement, and how he treats them. And so, to understand the Bible, you have to understand covenants, and it's good to have a timeline, because you can see the green down here, these are covenants, and we've actually drawn out the timeline for the covenants, because some of them don't last forever. Only actually one of the main covenants is still in existence today. And yet, you see, if you read the Old Testament, all 3 of these playing out at the same time, and that each one has its own implication and its own agreement with mankind. So it can be very confusing if you don't have that framework. So there are other covenants in the Bible other than these 4, but they're just not as significant as these 4. And they don't have as much biblical significance on the rest of the content of the Bible, in that we don't need to cover them for you to understand when you're reading like Isaiah, or if you're reading Psalms, or if you're reading Kings and Chronicles. If you understand the 4 major covenants, then you will be able to navigate through the scriptures. So, the 4 major covenants are the Adamic covenant, or the covenant of Adam, the Abrahamic covenant, or the covenant of Abram or Abraham, the Mosaic covenant, and then the New Covenant. And the New Covenant is the covenant of Jesus Christ.